All right, guys. So in this video, we're going to start the chapter on the endocrine system. And so the first things we're going to go over are some kind of overview information and some terminology and kind of some properties of the different types of hormones. And then in the next video, we'll start to dive into some of the endocrine glands and the hormones they produce and what they do. All right, so first of all, in the human body, there are two types of control systems. So last semester in A&P 1, you learned about the nervous system. And then now we are going to discuss the endocrine system. All right, so first thing we're going to do is compare and contrast those two, and figure out kind of how they're similar and how they're different so far as their signaling. Okay, so the type of signal sent by the nervous system, right? That would be an action potential, right? A nerve impulse. Okay, cool. Helps when the thing's connected. All right. So action potential versus with the endocrine system, the signal that is sent is a hormone, okay? And so remember, in the endocrine system, hormones are secreted into the blood and then they distribute systemically to all of the different organs and tissues in the body. Okay, and so then obviously, because of these two different types of signals, the speed between the two is going to be very different. So the nervous system, the speed with the nervous system is going to be very fast versus the speed with the endocrine system is going to be a bit slower because that hormone has to go into the blood and travel through the blood to its target tissue before it has an effect. All right, and so then also, because of the type of signal, the duration is going to be different for these two. So the duration for the nervous system is relatively short. All right, so you get that action potential, that initial signal, and then that's it. All right, unless you get multiple action potentials, then that might be a little different. But just from one signal, that's it. All right, versus the endocrine system, you get this, large kind of amount of hormone put into the blood, and it'll stay in the blood for a while, continuing to have an effect, right? So this would be a little more, we'll just say long-lived. All right, so it'll just last a little longer. Okay, and so finally, we have our types of targets. Okay, so this just means like, how does each system target the organ it wants to have an effect on? So the nervous system will just send an axon with an axon terminal directly to a location, right? So this would be a specific location. You learned all about that, particularly with muscles in A&P 1. All right, remember it sends that motor neuron sends an axon to that specific muscle it wants to control. And so that's going to be different from the endocrine system, which can have diffuse location, all right? Diffuse locations. Because that hormone is traveling in the blood, it can go out and it can reach any organ tissue. And so what's going to be important, and we'll talk about it in a minute, is that it's only going to affect specific tissues. But that hormone in the blood can reach all tissues. Okay, so that's kind of our comparison between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Now let's go through some terminology. All right, so our first term, obviously with the endocrine system, is going to be hormones. Okay, and so hormones are long distance chemical signals. Okay, and so they travel through the blood. So long distance chemical signals that are secreted into the blood and travel through the blood to their target. Okay, and so with the endocrine system, just to compare, you learned last semester, for example, with the skin, we learned about exocrine glands, all right? And so exocrine glands are going to be glands that secrete into a duct. This would be like the sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, that kind of thing. All right, so they secrete into ducts like we see here. So these little cells, these epithelial cells would secrete, if we're talking about, sweat or something, into this lumen, and then that would move up through this duct here. All right, so this would be the duct for that exocrine gland. Okay, so those are exocrine glands, and then those are different from our endocrine glands that we're going to be talking about in this chapter, because endocrine glands are ductless, right? They don't have ducts, so they don't have that series of cuboidal cells kind of arranged in, that tube shape. They just secrete directly into the blood. Okay, and so that's what we see here, right? So in this picture, this diagram, we have this cell, right? So this is going to be our secreting cell. This is our cell that's secreting hormone. So it's going to be secreting this hormone here, these little yellow dots. They're moving into the blood, all right? So this is an endocrine secretion. That's an endocrine cell. And then that's going to move through the blood a distance until it reaches this cell here. Okay, so this kind of green cell would be called a target cell. And what makes it a target cell is because it can respond to a hormone, right? So this is a cell that responds to the hormone. And the reason it responds to the hormone is because it contains on its cell surface a receptor for that hormone. Okay, so this would be something on the target cell that binds to the hormone. All right, so it binds to and is activated by that hormone. Okay, so then when this cell, all right, so if we were to identify the receptor on this picture, that would be this little guy here that's binding to that hormone, and then this would be the target cell. Okay, and so when that receptor binds to the hormone, it's going to have, just depending on the type of hormone and type of receptor, it's going to have an effect on that cell. Okay, so that is our kind of endocrine method of secretion. So we have our endocrine cell secreting its hormones into the blood. That hormone travels through the blood until it reaches a target cell that has a receptor on it. Okay, and so there are additional types of secretions that don't need ducts. So we're going to talk about those just very briefly here. That would be first of all, a paracrine secretion. All right, so this would be a secretion that comes from the secreting cell and it acts locally. Okay, so these are going to act on nearby cells. All right, so it's going to act locally. Okay, on neighboring cells. And so sometimes they're called local hormones, just for that reason, because they act on the nearby cells. All right, so this would be instead of, going into the blood and traveling a really long distance, they would just act with the nearby cells. And so an example of this would be histamine. So in the stomach, histamine is released by one of your, stomach cells, and it acts locally on other stomach cells to cause them to produce hydrogen ions. All right, so an example of this would be histamine. All right, so histamine, we'll just say in the stomach, and we're going to learn all about that when we talk about the digestive system. Okay, and so with this picture, this would be an example of a paracrine secretion. So this secreting cell secretes this hormone, this chemical signal, and it's going to bind to the receptor on a cell that's nearby, right? So that's going to be paracrine. Okay. And then lastly, we have an autocrine secretion. So an autocrine secretion will act on the secreting cell. All right. And so the cell that made the hormone, released it, is going to be also expressing the receptor for that hormone. Okay, so in this example, the cell secretes this hormone, and that hormone travels, right, until it binds to the receptor on the cell itself. Okay, so this would be an example of that autocrine secretion. So autocrine acts on the cell that made the signal, the hormone. Okay, good. So that's our terminology. All right, so that's hormones and how they travel through the blood and how they act on a cell because that cell has a receptor. All right, and so now let's talk about the kind of chemical structure of a hormone. And so the chemical structure of a hormone is going to determine how that hormone is able to affect the target tissue. Okay, and so there's two categories for the chemical structures of hormones. They're either going to be water soluble or they're going to be fat soluble. Okay, so we are going to start by talking about water soluble hormones. So these would obviously be polar things, right? They can dissolve in water. That means they're water soluble. Primarily, water soluble hormones are going to be protein or amino acid based in their kind of chemical makeup. All right, and so there's one exception to that, and that is the thyroid hormone, because the thyroid hormone, it's made from amino acid, but it's very fat soluble. Okay, so it's kind of the exception to the rule that if a hormone is protein or amino acid based, it's water soluble. Okay, and so water soluble means that it can dissolve in water. It also means that it cannot just diffuse through the plasma membrane. Okay, so it needs a membrane protein, right? You learned about that in A&P1. So it needs a membrane protein because it is water soluble, and the cell membrane is made up of lipids, right? And so the hormone, right? So this is our water soluble hormone here. It can't just pass through that cell membrane to get into the cell to have an effect on the cell. The cell needs to have some sort of protein on the surface that's going to transfer that information into the cell. Okay, and so these are called, this protein is called a cell surface receptor. Okay, so water soluble proteins need cell surface receptors. Okay, water soluble hormones, need cell surface receptors. Okay, and so that would mean that this would be the membrane of a target cell for the specific hormone. And so that hormone is going to go and it is going to bind to this cell surface receptor, all right? Because the receptor is on the surface of the cell. Okay, so let's talk about this receptor. So you should know this specific example of a kind of receptor and its mechanism for a water-soluble hormone. Okay, and so first of all, the way a receptor works is it's a protein, and it is made to specifically fit that hormone. All right, so it has like a lock and a key structure to where this part of the receptor, all right, has a specific shape that is made to only fit this hormone. So it is very specific. And so when that hormone binds to the receptor, what's going to happen is it's going to become activated. And this type of receptor, the example you need to know, is called a G protein. Coupled receptor. Okay, and it's a G protein coupled receptor because it's the blue part, the receptor, is coupled to this little purple guy, which is called a G protein. Okay, so that makes sense. That name makes sense. It's a G protein coupled receptor because the receptor is associated with a G protein. And so then what happens is when the hormone binds, that receptor is activated, and this little G protein is activated, it detaches from that receptor, and it can kind of glide down the membrane, just kind of float through the membrane until it finds this enzyme that is embedded in the membrane. Okay, and so what it does is it finds this. So this is a enzyme. All right, you learned in A&P1 that when you learned about membrane proteins, that sometimes there are enzymes embedded in the membrane. So this would be an example of that. All right, and so this enzyme is activated by G protein. All right, and once it's activated, it's going to perform its enzymatic function. And so what it does is it converts ATP, all right, that's what this little starburst is, and it converts ATP into this orange guy, which is called cyclic AMP. Okay. All right. So that would just be, so ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Cyclic AMP is cyclic adenosine monophosphate. All right, so we've lost two phosphates, and you make it kind of into a ring structure, and that is now going to be our intracellular signal. Okay, and so that signal with cyclic AMP, it depends on the cell. And the effect that hormone is going to have on it. It can go and open ion channels. It can activate other enzymes inside of the cell. All right, so it's going to just go and have an effect inside of the cell. Okay? And so, if you think about it, all right, kind of more big picture, the way this works with these water-soluble hormones is you have this signal outside of the cell, all right, that is our water-soluble hormone, and we need to transfer that signal, that information, to the inside of the cell. Okay, so we go from our hormone on the outside of the cell to our signal on the inside of the cell, which is now cyclic AMP. All right, that was the whole process, the whole point of the process. We just want to take the signal from the outside and get it to the inside. Okay, and that happened through this G protein coupled receptor. All right, so that's our water-soluble hormone, okay? And so then we have our fat-soluble hormones, okay? And so with our fat-soluble hormones, these are going to be steroid hormones. So that would be like testosterone and estrogen and cortisol. And then our exception, which is thyroid hormone, which is made of an amino acid, but it is fat-soluble. All right. Okay, so those are fat-soluble hormones. Because they are fat-soluble, they can just move straight into the cell. They can go straight through the plasma membrane. All right, so this is our fat-soluble hormone. It can just pass right through that plasma membrane. Okay, so it can move through the plasma membrane. Okay. All right, and so once it does, it can then have its own effect on the inside of the cell. So it doesn't need to transfer that signal, right? The actual hormone itself just moves into the cell. And so once it's inside of the cell, it needs to still find its receptor. And so these receptors for fat-soluble hormones are called intracellular receptors. So they are inside of the cell. So water-soluble hormones have cell surface receptors. Intracellular hormones have fat-soluble hormones have intracellular receptors. Getting a little tongue-tied. Okay. So one other important thing before we talk about the effect once the receptor binds about fat-soluble hormones is how they're transported in the blood. All right. So they have the advantage once they reach the cell of being able to move just straight into the cell through the membrane. However, fats are not soluble in blood. Blood is mostly water. So they need special transporters in the blood. All right. So these are going to be, so they need, we'll just say transporters to travel in the blood, because the blood is mostly water and these are fat soluble. Okay, and so those transporters are called globulins. Okay, so these fat soluble hormones are going to be surrounded by globulins. So these are just going to be proteins, transport proteins, all right, that are going to surround that hormone and allow it to travel in the blood. All right, so it's a transport protein. Just barely had enough room. There we go. And that is going to allow that hormone to move in the blood, and then it can reach the cell. Once it reaches the cell, it can just move straight into the cell. Okay. All right, now back to our inside of our cell. So that hormone moves through the membrane to the inside of the cell. Once it's there, it will encounter that intracellular receptor. It's going to bind to it, all right? So this guy is going to find one of these, bind to it, all right? And so now we have it's usually referred to as a complex. It just means the two are bound together, right? They form a complex. And that complex, we'll just label it here. Whoops. So complex is formed. All right, and then that complex is going to move. This is typical for fat-soluble hormones. That complex is going to move into the nucleus of the cell, and it is going to bind to and kind of sit down on a region of DNA. All right, and so once it does that, it is going to regulate gene expression, right? So here we're going from DNA to mRNA, like making a copy of DNA, okay? So it's going to regulate gene expression, all right, or protein expression, right? Because remember, the DNA codes for proteins. Okay, so it's going to regulate gene expression. It can cause proteins to be expressed more, or it can silence the region for a certain protein so it's not expressed. That will just depend on the hormone and its receptor. Okay, but it's going to regulate expression of proteins. Okay, so then the kind of last topic for these fat-soluble, water-soluble hormones is the fact that a cell can become more or less sensitive to these hormones based on the receptors it's expressing. And so if the cell wants to become more sensitive to the hormone, it will upregulate or add more receptors to its surface, right? So upregulation of receptors makes a cell more sensitive to a hormone. Okay. Versus downregulation. So for example, if we had with our water or our fat soluble here, downregulation would be the cell would destroy some of these. So maybe instead of 6, there's only 3 receptors left. That would make the cell less sensitive to a hormone. Okay. So a cell can kind of regulate how strong of an effect a hormone will have on it. All right, and so the last topic for this particular video, we're going to talk about negative feedback, just kind of a review from last semester to make sure you remember how negative feedback works. we're going to discuss it in terms of obviously hormones and the endocrine system. All right, and so blood glucose levels. Okay, and so with blood glucose levels, I'm sure you know they're kind of maintained in a narrow range. Your body doesn't like blood glucose to be too high, and it doesn't like it to be too low. Okay, and so this is regulated by hormones. So if blood glucose starts to increase, all right, and so this would be a very high blood glucose. And so those are the kind of blue dots, right, in that blood vessel. Those are going to be glucose molecules. And so it gets very high. So what's going to happen is that signal, right, a signal is going to be sent to the pancreas here saying, hey, blood glucose levels are too high. The pancreas is going to secrete insulin. All right, so insulin is a hormone secreted by the pancreas, and the job of insulin is to cause glucose to be taken out of the blood, and then once it's taken out of the blood, it goes to the liver where it's made into and stored as glycogen. All right, so we can just say, we'll just summarize, so glucose removed from blood. We'll obviously talk all about it when we get to the pancreas. Okay, and so then that brings us back down to our normal blood sugar levels. Okay, so then if the blood sugar gets too low, right, so we don't have enough glucose in the blood, the pancreas again is going to secrete a different hormone, right? So here it is going to secrete glucagon. Okay, and so glucagon's job is it goes to the liver and it tells the liver there's not enough glucose, and then the liver is going to break down glycogen to release the glucose. Okay. And so then we have that glucose going into the blood, bringing that blood sugar back up. All right, and so this is just a review of negative feedback. And so if you remember, the function of negative feedback is to maintain homeostasis, right? So homeostasis of temperature, of blood glucose, of any number of things, right? So pH for sure. All right, and so whenever something gets too high, there will be a mechanism to bring it back down to normal. And if something gets too low, there'll be a mechanism to bring it back up to normal. All right, so that's negative feedback.